All right. Now let's go to full screen here. Yeah, go ahead. Anyway, so thanks for spending a little bit of time this afternoon here. As I was introduced, I'm Alan Percy. I'm the Senior Director of Product Marketing for Dialogic, and put together this presentation and a little bit of a story to help sort of get the juices flowing, to thinking about IoT and where we're going from here. So let's see. Just a quick overview of Dialogic. I think most of you folks probably know who the company is. We're 30 years of experience in doing multimedia applications, driving much of the telecom industry. It's sort of interesting to see how telecom has sort of morphed into a web world and enabled some of this. So let's just spend a minute and talk about the Internet of Things and some of the applications. As Dean sort of mentioned, you know, there are all kinds, and if you've spent the day with us here, there's all kinds of interesting applications for Internet of Things, or devices being now IP enabled, or being part of a greater network. You know, some of them are obvious sort of sexy applications, like some of the home automation applications, some of the drone applications, and others. They don't necessarily all have the same sort of communication dependencies. So what we sort of decided to do is start to look at some of the applications and think in terms of, okay, some of them are definitely communications enabled, and some of them maybe aren't. So maybe some situations that maybe aren't is like an automated system to measure how much beer is in a beer keg, which would be quite valuable for somebody who distributes beer to know when the keg is getting empty, so he can send a driver out and replace it in advance. And last time we did this presentation, we came up with a business model of beer as a service. So if anybody's looking for a little business model, I think you might have something there. Others, though, do tend to be more focused on applications that have communications. For example, in automobile or in vehicle applications. We already showed this healthcare application and, you know, others like that. So there's definitely situations where communications is obvious, but others maybe where it's not quite so obvious. So I thought we'd do is just talk about, you know, if these devices are out in the network and they sense things that need to be dealt with, if they don't have a means to communicate, sort of the, you know, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it really make any noise? And that's one of the issues, I think, with some of these IoT applications, is that it's important for them to be able to communicate to the people who matter, who can resolve whatever issues and take the next step. It's very important for them to communicate. So let me just give you a quick example. So here's our beer keg, and the beer keg has decided it's running low, and it could, over the internet, report to some central console at the beer distributor, and there could be a chart and a bar graph, and the you know, maybe the dispatcher at the beer distributor could say, aha, I need to schedule a refill of the Sam Adams over at McCarthy's you know, pub, so I'm going to schedule that for next Thursday, and that could work great. Well, you know, maybe when that driver is out on his route and he happens to have another keg of Sam Adams on the truck, he could be notified over his smartphone device, right? He could have an app on his smartphone device that would be dictating his route for the day, and it could be notified, and he could make a stop at McCarthy's, or if he's already on his stop at McCarthy's. Then there are other situations, like, well, what about the manager the manager that's at McCarthy's? Maybe you want to notify him that the driver's going to make a special stop, to notify him so he unlocks the door, because you might get there at 11 o'clock, which is a little early to get started. So maybe, you know, the manager doesn't necessarily have that app or have it down, you know, on his phone, because, you know, he's just a manager of a bar, right? So you send him a text message. So the distributor sends him a text message saying, hey, we're going to stop by at 11 o'clock today. Our driver's going to be in the neighborhood and refill, you know, the Sam Adams keg. That sounds good. Well, the other application might need to not just text them, but maybe actually call them. Maybe there's no response to the text message, or maybe, you know, there's an urgent situation. Maybe you need to use voice to do that kind of notification. So not every user, not every situation has the same kind of communications or requirements, and I'll give you another example here in a minute. And this is a real-world example. Turns out our family's had a summer home down at a little lake down in western New York for a couple generations, and we share a well with about 40 other families. and it's a spring that's this is the spring house I'm showing you here that gets water from a natural spring, and over the years we've just had a pump and pumps the water through a piping system over to everybody's house, and everything was fine. Well, a few years ago, the county came to us and said, 40 families on the spring, you really need to treat the water. You should be filtering or chlorinating the water. And they forced us to make some upgrades to it. So we did, and now the system on the left, that's actually the spring. I know it looks kind of dark, but it's just it's where the water comes in underneath the building. And over on the right is some of the plumbing that's part of the water treatment system. And I'll tell you about how this works here in a second. But the regulation from the county government basically forced us to start to treat the water, and of course the issue with treating the water is now this equipment needs to be taken care of, right? There's chlorine that needs to be filled, there's filters that need to be changed, and the water level in the spring is, especially this summer, has been a bit of a concern because we've had some really beautiful weekends. 40 families leaning on the spring can draw it down, but on top of that, we have all these guests and friends that stop by for the weekend. So we've actually run into situations where we've sucked the well dry. So here's how the system works. And it basically, the pumps through some media filters. There's some pressure gauges on it. There's a UV sanitizer. Then there's a chlorination system. And then there's some contact tanks. And then eventually the water heads out in through the piping off into the neighborhood. And as an operator of the system, that there's some gauges that need to be read. We need to look at the pressure differential across the media filters to see if they're getting plugged up. We need to check to see how much chlorine is in there. So we thought, this is a perfect job to automate it. So, of course, I rush out and buy a Raspberry Pi and a bunch of sensors and start fiddling around with this thing. But the issue is if this thing detects, the chlorine level's getting low or the water level's getting low or that media filter needs to be changed, unless it has a way to communicate to people outside that little shed, there's just going to be an LED blinking on this little Raspberry Pi, and that's it. It needs a way to be able to tell somebody, come pay attention to me. So with Vince's help, we kind of hatched the idea that we're going to put together a little application that then would use Telestacks and our Dialogic Media Server to go out and start to do some messaging and basic little algorithm. If it senses an alarm, it's going to trigger a script that would be up in RESTCOM, and that would be able to either send text messages or make phone calls to people that are in there. So we think it's important for these IoT applications to be able to communicate. Alarms happen, situations arise. It might need to, text one person and make a voice phone call to the little old lady that's at the end of the loop. But maybe we would be able to have an app on a device for us. So I think there's lots of opportunities for IoT and communication APIs and real-time communications to leverage each other. So we're kind of excited about this whole topic and looking forward to hearing your guys' ideas on these kinds of solutions. So with that, I guess I'll turn it back to you, Dean, and we'll go from here. Right. Sure.
Sure. And Alan, thanks for that. And we'll take some questions at the end, but I'd like to introduce now Aaron Syme up to the stage. And hopefully, we've got your presentation here somewhere as well. That's a flash drive. Last one. Excellent. Aaron was speaking yesterday. He's from WebRTC Ventures and also runs a really good weekly newsletter as well.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Dean. Yeah, that's realtimeweekly.co, free newsletter about WebRTC and other real-time technologies. You can definitely check it out. Appreciate that. So I'm CEO and co-founder of a development company, WebRTC Ventures. We build custom web and mobile applications around video, primarily using WebRTC technologies. And what I wanted to kind of intro my part of today with is start with a hack that we made last year, actually at TAD Hack here in Chicago, and talk a little bit about that and then kind of where I see that going next, because I think it has some interesting combinations of communications and IoT. So we started with the premise last year, I think it was actually my business partner's idea of let's do something with an Apple Watch and maybe something with the heart rate monitor. And one of our developers on our team, Nestor, was here with me. In addition to being a great arm model, that's his arm in the photo, he's also an excellent developer and really interested in math, really good at math. So he found an algorithm to kind of help look at the heartbeat over a relatively recent period of time and see if maybe you're having a heart attack. So what he put together was basically using the heart rate monitor on the watch and watching for irregularities in the beat that might indicate you're having a problem, that you're maybe having a heart attack right now. And if you are, then it put up a little message on the watch, not readable there, but basically saying, everything okay? Your heart rate went crazy for a moment. Do you want to notify someone? And if you don't say anything, if you don't say no, then we assume you may have fallen to the ground, you may be in distress, and the application automatically notifies loved ones that you have pre-configured in the app. You could say no and it'll stop. Maybe it was false detection, right? And just to kind of talk about what that involved, there were a number of different platforms that we integrated into that Node.js application. We used Matrix and RESTCOM and Tropo, and just for fun, put in a Slack integration too, though that's probably not the best place to send medical alerts, but then again, some of us look at Slack more than anything else, so who knows. And this was a really fun hack. Nestor won a prize for it, did a great job. And an interesting thing, of course, being a good marketing person, I blogged about it afterwards. We had quite a few people who contacted us and said, when is this going to be on the store? I really want this, and some really interesting use cases, actually, of why they were. It was more than just, I'm worried I'm going to have a heart attack. There was actually someone interested in it because they're interested in preserving, I forget what it's called, but the cryo freeze of bodies, and so if you were going to die, they wanted to know right away so that they could get your body frozen quickly so that they could bring you back to life someday later. So some really interesting people contacted us and said, when is this going to be in the store? I love the idea of the application and taking data like that and using it to communicate directly to humans, something super valuable and maybe save a life. But then I made the mistake of talking to some lawyers and healthcare people. And this is where actually my question to you earlier came from, Brian, is at what point what is diagnosis and based on data, and what can we do and not do? And in this case, we're not trying to give a diagnosis with the application. We're really just trying to maybe give you a warning and save a life. And if you are having a heart attack and are incapacitated, then it makes sends a text message and would also make an automated text-to-voice phone call to someone saying, Aaron's having a heart attack, and by the way, here's his GPS coordinates in the text message too, so you could actually go find where I am. So that's not really a diagnosis, but at the same time, they said, well, there's a lot of liability concern there, because you could save a life, but what if somebody has a heart attack and your app didn't catch it? Then you might get sued. And I don't have deep pockets to get sued, so we haven't really gone anywhere with this, which is a shame because I do love the idea of notifying people in emergency situations like this. So that's just kind of led me to think about, well, what are other use cases where maybe I'm less likely to be sued? If you have different advice of how we could take that to market, or you want to buy the code or something like that, definitely let me know, because I'd love to see that heart attack monitor be used somehow. But other use cases, so I've got an Amazon Echo now, lots of fun. I mainly use it for, it's great radio, cool radio, listen to some news, and I order my dog food through Amazon on it, which is nice. But what are the more cool things we might do with that in the future? And I see definitely applications around more social interaction with family members remotely, maybe personal safety applications, maybe the good kind of home monitoring. And so that got me thinking about a use case kind of like this, where Imagine that you have perhaps an elderly relative who has, it doesn't have to be an Amazon Echo, but just something with that same sort of voice recognition, a little bit of AI built into it, and perhaps it's got a little more two-way capability to it also. So for example, if this Echo-like device is sitting on the counter in my parents' home, I could maybe just send a message directly through that and just like, hey mom, how you doing today? And we could have a two-way conversation through the device, and it makes for, for really quick, easy communication. Maybe we could set up, it could be tied into our personal calendar, and again, kind of on the social interaction side, it also, when you say, good morning Alexa, if you've ever done that, it kind of gives you some little funny tidbit about the day. Maybe it could also say, hey, and by the way, Aaron told you that the kids have a game today, so don't forget to call the kids and see how the game went, right? And then now maybe let's go on to something more around like emergency notifications. What if this is tied into other home automation or home security or monitoring aspects that if we're dealing with an elderly person, living on their own, maybe it's detecting that, hey, they haven't gotten up and moved in quite some time. Or they went into the bathroom and they haven't come back out. What happened, right? So the device calls out, hey, notice you haven't moved around lately. Are you okay? Kind of an audible version of what you saw we did on the Apple Watch there. And if they don't respond, but we know somehow through the home monitoring that they're still in the home, but they didn't respond, maybe this is an emergency situation. Maybe it needs to contact me as their, as a family member, contact their kids or something. Or maybe the person has fallen on the floor and can't get up, the old stereotype there, but a real fear for a lot of people. And they can call back to the device and say, I've fallen, I can't get up, I have to use the phrase, call my family, call 911, do something like that. So a little more audio interaction. So a combination of audio interaction, voice recognition, data from sensors and home automation. And so this is just kind of a brainstorming idea I have here. Probably, sure, I'm not the only person with this exact combination of ideas, and I know a lot of people are thinking about it. Feel free to build it yourself before I get around to it too. But I think it's an interesting example of how we can really combine IoT and data with things that really bridge that gap between machines and humans, and since we're WebRTC developers, maybe even tie in video chat into this with it's not part of the Echo, but whatever device we build or integrate with this, and it's all sorts of things we might do there. So that's my food for thought.
Thank you, Aaron. That was very interesting. So both of these are just sort of hacks at the moment, but are you seeing anything which is sort of commercially similar? It was interesting the comment about the Apple Watch, and I'm wearing a Fitbit. That makes me wonder whether there are either alerts you can do, or whether it's just not sufficiently robust yet for it to actually trust.
I haven't seen something that's doing exactly that, though. In some digital healthcare conferences that I've attended, people have talked about, use cases and scenarios somewhat similar to this, and certainly home monitoring and emergency notification around that. In one mobile and wearables conference I attended, they were making the point that although people, kind of back to that legal and liability issue, unfortunately, that a lot of companies who have ideas around, somewhere in this space, but they're concerned about liability, are instead starting with things more like a Fitbit that are more about personal fitness, where presumably you're not going to die if there's a bug in the app. And they're using that as kind of a gateway maybe to their grander ideas in the future, but this is a much safer place to start in the consumer market.
So in other words, it might start off as if your heart rate hasn't gone above a certain level, you get a call from your personal trainer saying, go for a run now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So, last of our three panelists you've already seen is Brian Polito. And again, Brian has a quick initial presentation, and then we'll open up the rest of the panel.
I got it on here.
You got it. You got it. Which one? The silver one. Silver one, right. Safely removed. Yeah. Actually, the one that I really like to have which is not so much communicate, well, it's indirectly communication related. I think one of the use cases here is to allow IoT to improve communications rather than be directly involved in the interaction. So, for example, if you had a device that was capable of listening to a presentation and vibrated, if I was talking too fast and it sort of went like, it buzzed on my arm, it would allow me to communicate better in context, whether that's in a real environment or on a phone call. And so, there's possibly interesting uses of these as sort of adjacent sensors as well as ones integrated.
There's actually been some work with using DAC as almost a metronome for musicians on vacation. Kind of like you put traffic things in your ears on your wrist.
Yeah.
Honestly, if I'm using my wrist to play, I don't think I want to put that on there to distract. But it's a good concept. I can see as a speaker something that got me every 30 seconds so every time I talk.
Calm down. There was a good WebRTC demo I saw last year, which was it just measured the relative size of the contribution to a conversation from both sides, and essentially flashed up a warning that said, "You're dominating the conversation. Shut up and let the other person talk." Right.
Okay, so I don't know who was here from the cognitive presentation. In a previous life, I spent a lot of time working on WebRTC, integrating WebRTC capabilities into WebSphere, but also working on a number of open source components to better integrate WebRTC capabilities into IoT. I did a presentation here last year called "Could IoT be WebRTC's greatest source of innovation?" And in that presentation, I kind of explored sort of these two broad cases around, using WebRTC as a way to collect information, context, as well as using IoT to trigger WebRTC conversations. I was super excited about this stuff. There's a tool called Node-RED, which is an IoT sort of integration tool for everything. It runs on Node.js, and we created nodes for Node-RED, and we created an open source protocol that actually was built on MQTT, which is an IoT protocol. We wanted, I felt like the deeper we can sort of integrate real-time communications into the fabric of IoT, the more use cases and the more interesting things we could do with it. To some degree, I mean, what we've seen, and this may be, I have this year's perspective with the disclaimer because, at IBM we do a lot of stuff with IoT, with MQTT, for instance, but it's all MQTT is a very lightweight protocol. It's designed to be massively scalable and not really well designed for media streaming. And, I really felt like at the time, a media stream is just another form of context that could come from an IoT device. And I still feel that way. I think I thought the presentation today on the fog node stuff was really interesting because one of the things that I think is going to be important for media to really become part of sort of the core of IoT is to be able to push the processing closer to those endpoints. And there's been a couple of presentations today on pushing applications right down to the devices, running them on fog nodes. I think that's kind of a critical thing, at least not for the triggering case, but for the case where media is actually coming from the devices themselves. And there's a whole class of use cases around that, right? One that we did a demo around was a video surveillance use case where you could have hundreds of maybe thousands of cameras spread throughout the city. And most of the time, the data being collected from those cameras there's nothing interesting going on, and you certainly don't want to be streaming that back to a core cloud service. You want to be processing that as close to the edge where that device lives as possible, and maybe only open the stream to the cloud to a to somebody who's monitoring an agent that's sitting in a sitting in a contact center or sitting someplace. You would only forward those streams on an as-needed basis, maybe, to the core network. So I think that's in terms of things that will need to be for MediaStream to become part of the IoT fabric. I think that's important. I was glad to see. I wasn't aware of the fog stuff going on. That was pretty cool. Network bandwidth, obviously, the cheaper it gets, the more media can kind of be pushed out to those devices. Better definition for how RTC integrates with IoT. Henning's discussion I thought was interesting because he talked about the fact that, a lot of young developers right now aren't doing as much protocol development. They're more around Swagger and REST APIs, and everything's API driven. And I think, I mentioned this to Vince earlier, I think there's an interesting place there for doing something similar to what's been done with Swagger for WebSockets, for instance, to sort of define contracts between devices and the back-end services that may process those data, something that's more of a definition language around WebSocket kinds of protocols or MQTT kinds of protocols. I think that could kind of help accelerate some of the things that need to be automated and put in place for these things to work. And just in general, like I said, a disclaimer, at IBM, we, at least my view of what's going on within our company is our focus has been on an IoT platform as a service. We, provide MQTT message brokers in the cloud, and we do a lot of work around registration of devices, and we have verticals around insurance, IoT for insurance, and different products like that. But it's all very focused on event-driven message, lightweight message stuff. So I'm not sure if that's because that's, mostly where our salespeople are working, or if it's some of these things are not quite there yet, like fog nodes, for instance, aren't disseminated and pervasive enough to enable some of these media streaming services. So anyway, that's it.
Great.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Sorry.
Do you have something to share?
No.
Okay. Just grab that.
So I mean, that last note of caution was interesting, and it sort of makes me wonder if there's certain classes of thing which are more aligned with communications than others. I mean, I was reading something today, looking at what devices have cameras in at all. So it sort of obviously makes sense that if you're going to be doing video communications or audio communications, at the very least you need either a camera or a microphone or a display if you've got inbound data. So a car increasingly will have cameras, particularly self-driving ones where they may have other input sensors. Whereas, I don't know, a moisture sensor in a field, there's no communications that it can generate. And I would imagine from IBM's point of view, you're going to want to have thousands or millions of those under management. So what are the patterns here? Aaron and Alan, you got any thoughts as well?
Well, it's like I mentioned, I think that there are certain applications that initially you say, well, they're not directly dealing with media, but they indirectly trigger media, right? So there's sort of a category of application that's focused on initiating conversations or initiating a media session, but it's not necessarily directly involved. That other category that are directly involved, for example, the in-vehicle systems or the cameras on a car or security systems or in-home security, they're directly involved in the media streams. And the side effect of course, that the differentiation is trying to look at the application and say, all right, where does it need to be done? Does it need to be done in the device? Does it need to be done in the cloud? Are there regulations, like Brian talked earlier about PCI compliance, about where it actually happens, and making some wise decisions on the application. So I think really it depends on the application. It depends on what's available.
Yeah, so in terms of broad categories, I think triggering real-time communications from IoT, that's obvious. That seems like the low-hanging fruit here, and certainly we've created demos around that. The tougher one, I think, is when you actually talk about real-time media as as what's being generated from those sensors. And and there's so much more infrastructure that has to be in place, I think. I think that's why it's been a little bit slower, at least from my perspective, seeing that come into existence. But in terms of broad categories, I'd say those are kind of the ones I look at.
I agree. I think that they've said it all already. They're not, everything should be streaming video all the time. That's a little creepy.
Yeah, have a connected, that collective flower pot there is...
Right. But I think the what use cases and when you trigger those additional streams is definitely very interesting to me.
I mean, I'm sort of coming to the view that there's probably three broad categories. You've got IoT triggering communications, IoT participating in communications as a device like a CCTV camera, and then IoT enabling or enhancing communications where, I don't know, this microphone might be smart because it might be able to have a sensor to work out how close I am to the microphone and adjust the levels rather than me having to lean in or lean out. So you could potentially use awareness of the physical environment of a conference room or something like that to make the experience better, or dim the lights. If the contrast was lousy, or you're wearing the wrong colour shirt, it turns it black. Yeah, who knows? And also, I think there's like another axis between: are we talking about one device, like the water pump, or are we talking about many devices, such as sensors in a field or a factory? Yeah, and I think the trigger from one device, and sort of the way that one device is going to work with the network is going to be very different to a fleet of them.
Correct. Yep. Or like, for example, the beer keg example, right?
Yeah.
If every single beer keg in a metropolitan area has a sensor on it, it's a very different story than if just one of them does. So it's sort of the
Yeah. And I suppose the interesting thing I thought from Henning's point of view was talk earlier is the idea of streaming data as a sort of a media form, particularly if you've got process control. I think you showed a little Honeywell gizmo that it was talking about 10 or 250 times a second, which is starting to look like a media stream, even if it's not audio or video. Incidentally, you've got a small audience, so we can talk amongst ourselves, but put your hand up or just shout out if you've got anything to add in. There you go.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah, and it has to be good beer too, not just any beer. Good beer. Yeah. Well, the funny part about that one was, as I mentioned, we talked previously. The conversation went off in this path of, okay, so if I know when the beer keg is going to be empty, and I can dispatch somebody to refill the beer keg, then we're measuring the beer as it comes out of the keg. Can we charge the bar based on how many ounces have gone out of the keg this week, as opposed to charging them for the whole keg? And that's so the beer as a service sort of came up, and it's like, wait a second here, yeah. So it's a continuous stream of media that's telling them that when the beer's coming out of the keg, then I can charge them on the week or by the day for actually what they sell, so that the beer is owned by the distributor while it's still inside the keg, but the minute it leaves the keg, it's then sold. And it's sort of like it changes the whole business model all over a little tiny sensor that just measures the flow of a liquid.
Yeah, it's interesting because, that same problem applies to software components, being able to measure minutes on a call or whatever. All those things start looking like IoT devices that can feed information to a billing system. Or
it's almost like sale or return, I guess. It's sort of model for beer. So that's
got you thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. One question I have, and this ties into Brian's presentation, is how often do we actually need voice interactions related to the trigger things, or how much of the time is it going to be messaging, notifications, automation? If the temperature sensor in a piece of manufacturing machinery goes above a threshold, does the supervisor really need to phone the engineer and say, check it's not on fire? Or are they just going to fire a message off or an email, or it's just going to be an instant app notification or something? Where does voice fit in this?
I think it's cost. I think it's based on how critical the problem is and how quickly it has to be dealt with and whether it can be dealt with automation or not, probably.
So my little issue in the pump house, and this is firsthand, is, I've got 40 neighbors, probably half of them have smartphones, but I don't think that they're all going to install an app on a phone. And if I tell them, if you use this app and you can see the water level and the chlorine level on the pumps, they're not going to do that. They don't really care. But if I certainly could text them, but then there's this other little section of the neighborhood that still has landlines and still has flip phones. I have to communicate with them using different means to correctly communicate them, to tell them that the water pressure is low, and because we're running low on water, so start to conserve it. So it was a matter of your constituency, who you're trying to communicate with. You have to use different media to communicate to different people across the board. And I think we live in earlier today I heard somebody said we live in our Silicon Valley bubble, right? And we all have smartphones, we're all connected all the time, but the reality is, I got a good friend of mine who's an ambulance driver, and that's what he does for a career. He's a volunteer fireman, ambulance driver. He's got a freaking flip phone still, and he says, I'm not giving that thing up. It costs me $20 a month, and I'm thrilled with it. So, you want to communicate with him, it's a little different story. So,
What's the role of sort of service providers, whether it's an outsourcing company or a managed service provider or a platform as a service provider? Do you see sort of opportunities for the Twilios of this world or other IBMs of this world in providing these sort of either the glue services for triggers or some other sort of hybrid API-based model here?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there because, and I think this is also related to the previous question of, it should be up to the consumers of the specific notification. How do they like to receive it, and which channel is that? And so, to the degree that service providers and platforms can make it easy to just put a message out there from a device and let some bus or some platform on that on the other side of that determine how does this user in the team prefer to get their message? Is it text during this time of day and voice later in the day, that sort of thing, and sort of let those decisions be made elsewhere. So I think there's an opportunity for that middleware to basically take the rest of the communication out of. Make it not be necessary to handle all of those different possibilities in, say, each individual device, all the channels.
Yeah. So certainly IBM plays in this space heavily, right? We have an IoT platform, we have a Node.js platform. So to me, it's about, as a platform, the role they play is they need to be open enough to be able to integrate a lot of different kinds of services. Because to me, the Internet of Everything, right? You have, you could find, there's so many different things that you might want to integrate with. Twitter, or, a device triggering event in Twitter, or a Twitter event triggering something else. I mean, all those things. You want a platform that's open and flexible enough that people can add whatever they can dream up and may turn into some really important use case that nobody's thought about.
And I think part of your question also dealt with deployment models. All right? If in developing an application, there are PCI compliance, there's HIPAA compliance, in fact, last week I had a little sit down with somebody who does web development for doctors' offices and learned first, from this conversation about this, there's this fine line that with healthcare information, what can go in on a traditional website versus has to be in the patient management or information system. And for example, you can't just create a website and say, type in all your personal healthcare information into my website, because that website may not be HIPAA compliant. So therefore, there's a line. And the side effect of that is that when they're putting together applications, is you need to be able to say, okay, is it okay for it to be in the cloud on a Twilio or in a public platform or a cloud platform, or does it need to go on premise, and does it need to be in a managed environment? or a private cloud. So I think the application, the industry that it's in is going to dictate which one of those two you have to choose. And the key thing is choosing technology that can go both ways, right? If you lock yourself into only cloud, then there's a whole huge industry, a $3 trillion healthcare industry that you're going to miss out on, and probably another $5 trillion banking industry you're going to miss out on. So I think it's critically important as you choose these platforms, you make sure they can go both ways.
I thought one of the interesting examples I saw of IoT plus communications was very interesting one last week was Verizon using drones to check on the status of their cell towers in Florida after the hurricane. They're streaming back video. And I thought that was it was interesting for a whole host of reasons, not least of which is you actually finding a service provider use a fairly innovative technology in an operational context.
Yeah.
And I thought that was
That's
very
cool. That's cool.
I mean, that one is an interesting one. I've seen a couple of people talk about using drones or other devices as observation tools, where perhaps you have an operator. You have to have an operator of the drone. You have to have the owner of a land or a piece of asset, like a farm or a cell tower operator, and then potentially a third party who's an expert. So it might be flying a drone over a field, and you have an irrigation expert or a crop expert able to diagnose certain patterns.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah. In fact, or actually, there's even our concept of what a thing is might vary there. I heard that the African equivalent of that in somewhere in I think it was Nigeria or Cameroon, where you're not going to be able to get a $1,000 drone. So there actually are genuinely people who tie a $40 cell phone to a helium balloon and walk it across the field with a video camera on, beaming that back down. So I thought that was there's going to be quite a lot of interesting ingenuity and hacks here, both physical hacks and software hacks.
I hate to break it to you, but I did run my GoPro up my kite once just to see if I could do it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Any other
jerky?
Any questions? Okay, one other thing. I mean, audio is a lot more than speech. Do you see sort of any interaction models where we're using, whether it's WebRTC or even telephony or something else, to use audio connected to a stethoscope for heartbeat, or to sort of listen to someone breathing from a medical point of view, or there's a variety of sort of use cases here which are not what we think of as either talking heads for video or speaking heads for voice.
Cool.
Yeah, we've done a telehealth application that involved integration of an additional audio channel for stethoscope, so definitely see that. And I think that there are a lot of use cases where the voice can give you additional data, sentiment analysis through Watson or others, and using that to indicate more. For example, a product research platform that we have to indicate nervousness in a voice or general happiness level with the product that they're using as part of a research session. So I think you can get a lot of extra data from that in the same way that you could from facial analysis with a video stream too. So yeah, I think there's a lot more data that could be accessed there.
I was just going to add, it's amazing when I started researching the sensors for the little water project, went to Mouser and started looking at sensors. It's amazing what you can buy for sensors now. I mean, they're cheap. I mean, they're relatively inexpensive. Where proximity sensors and specialized microphones and all kinds of things. And probably in the past you had to use some very specialized, probably PLC controller to convert the signals. And a lot of them now have USB plugs on them, and it's very. I was really surprised. So it wouldn't surprise me that you start to see those kinds of medical devices with USB ports on them.
Yeah. One thing that's kind of everybody's touched on a little bit is just the processing of that data, the cognitive aspects of it, trying to identify a gunshot or something like that. It's back to which use case, I guess, you're in. Are you monitoring thousands of microphones, or are you monitoring one? You know, obviously thousands is going to require some kind of audio processing capability that's automated, that's only going to notify you when something interesting's happening. And I think, you know, one problem we have at IBM is our Watson services are all cloud-based. So, you know, I think there's opportunities for lighter weight audio video processing capabilities, like somebody, I guess you mentioned on Fog, having a store where you could pull certain applications down to a Fog node and run certain processing capabilities close to where the audio is being generated. I think that's a huge opportunity, a huge space.
Yeah, no, it reminds me, a couple of years ago, I got to go on a guided tour around some of the experiments at CERN in Geneva and the Large Hadron Collider. And I was really taken with the fact that in one of the biggest experiments, the CMS, which was, I think, where they actually discovered the Higgs, they get such a lot of data out of that. Even though it's CERN, they need to filter 99% of the data out in hardware as close to the detector underground as possible. They have banks of hardware discriminators to actually bin 99% of the data because they can only pump so many gigabytes a second out to the data center. And yeah, doing that sort of local analytics and processing, I think, is going to be an interesting challenge here.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're winding up because I think there's a reception starting at 5:30. Nods from the back of the room.
Yep.
Any last thoughts? Where if we come back in a year's time, IoT and communications, or will I be a robot here communicating with you?
Yeah. Well, we chatted at lunchtime about, trying to do virtual events, and it'll never be the same, right? No, my take on the whole thing is I think, we're just at the beginning to understand. It was sort of interesting, the lunchtime keynote, thinking about, taking everyday items and starting to internetize them. I think that's only the tip of the iceberg, but I think that there are far more things that we can do in healthcare and insurance and vehicle automation is I think you would be amazed in a matter of 4 or 5 years, the smarts and the communications that are going to go inside vehicles and transportation systems. And we're, frankly, and communications is going to be an active part of it. You can be part of the solution. So it's going to be exciting times, I think.
Yeah, I agree, Alan. I think we're at, even though IoT's been around for a while, and I just think we're at the very early stages in terms of media and in all the different things that you can kind of derive from real-time media streaming from devices. And I think a lot of the infrastructure you'll start seeing evolve with over the next couple of years to make interesting things more possible than they are today.
Yeah. Aaron, last word.
Smell vision. The future is smell vision. No, I think I think the interesting stage that we're at here is bringing human touch back to streaming data and to real-time communications of the data part of it. And so, machine-to-machine communications is definitely fascinating. But what I'm really interested in is things like the cognitive engines of when do we determine when the device communication requires a human response, and how we can bring that human element into huge data sets, and when and how the best way to do that, I think, is fascinating. So I'll be very curious in a year from now to see what additional use cases there are about that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, gents.
All right, thank you.
And I think we now have reception downstairs in the bog, I believe.
I haven't actually met you.
Floor down